Bluff catching is an art that requires a keen understanding of your opponent's tendencies, a solid grasp of hand reading, and nerves of steel. In this video, we'll break down the key concepts of bluff catching, share some real-life examples from the poker world, and equip you with the tools to make those tough decisions at the table. Before I jump in, I wanted to give you an outline of what my bluff catching process looks like and what is going through my head. So the first thing I'm thinking about is my hand range. How strong of a hand do I have? And do I have a bluff catcher? Is this a hand I slow played and I'm always going to call on the river? Is this a hand that I feel like I might be beating some bluffs, but I'm not beating a lot of their value? Is this a hand that I'm always folding? Am I, where am I with my hand strength? That's the first thing that goes through my head. Once I've identified that I have a bluff catcher, I move on to the next step, which is identifying both ranges. It's important to follow through the hand what each range is, but it's also good to remember what everyone has from the start to the finish, because that's going to allow you to have a picture in your head of what their strong hands look like and what their weak hands look like and how your hand falls within that range. Then I'm going to think about my blockers. Am I removing those strong hands? Am I removing the weak hands? How do my blockers affect their range, and how do they affect my calling frequency? That is most of the time going to be what determines at the end of my decision whether or not I'm going to bluff catch. So let's jump into the example, and throughout the whole hand, you're going to hear a lot of these concepts being discussed, mainly the hand strength, identifying both ranges, and the discussion of blockers. Let's walk through the hand that I'm going to use for our scenario. We open ace queen off in the cutoff, and we get 3-bet by these small blinds. This is a scenario in which I am going to have a high frequency call. Ace queen off in position here, going to defend. And so we defend, the flop becomes 8-6-2. This is a board texture in which villain is going to have a lot of checks. The 3-bet range from the small blind is going to contain a lot of Broadway cards. So whenever you see a texture that has low cards 8 and under, low cards 9 and under, 10 and under, you're going to see a high frequency check raise from the small blind with the strong hands and a mix of check raising with some weaker hands. But let's take a look at the actual solution from GTO Wizard. Here's the solution of the scenario that we were just looking at, 8-6-2 flop, and we can see that the small blind does in fact have a high frequency check. So I'm going through all of these nodes because it's really important to understand that getting to the river and bluff catching in that scenario is going to require an intense knowledge of all of the ranges prior. So if we don't understand what villain is repping by the river, it's really difficult to understand what hands are going to be bluff catches. So it is important to not only study just the river for bluff catching, but also the ranges leading up to the river. So that's why we're covering them right now. So we take a look here, and like I said, we're going to see a lot of checking from the small blind. We have the option of either betting with our ace queen for a small sizing or checking back. In game, I decided to check back. So as we play the video, we continue. You can see my thought of possibly betting small. Is this ever a bet when check two? Not sure. We get to the turn and the turn pairs. And the first interesting node is that the small blind decides to lead for a large sizing. Now, this is a sizing that isn't necessarily in the solution for GTO Wizard, but it is a very common sizing in game. So first we're going to look at what GTO Wizard solutions want to do against this sizing, and then we're going to node lock to show the difference between what reality might be for the players in the pool. So in game, like I said, villain used a large sizing. However, GTO Wizard wants to use the overbet as the solution in this scenario. And that's because on the turn, we're going to have a very polarized range. We're going to have aces, kings, and queens and jacks that we saw check on the flop. And those were the hands that we're going to check raise at a high frequency. We also could have an 8 as the small blind, hands like ace-8 suited, which are going to be included in their range. So it makes sense to have a overbet polarized range for the turn as the small blind after the action goes check, check. So we see here that the sizing is an overbet. And in that is going to be including aces, kings, queens, jacks, 8x, right? All of these hands. Now, when we're facing the overbet as the cutoff, you'll see that ace-queen becomes indifferent to defending. And that's because we have a lot of strong hands that we can check back the flop with. However, this hand is a good hand to bluff catch because it blocks a lot of the strongest parts of villain's range. So it blocks aces, it blocks queens, and it blocks ace-8 suited for the particular combo that I had. So in my head, I was thinking, okay, I'm blocking a lot of their value. We have some showdown value because some of their weaker hands should be hands like 10-9 suited, broadways that didn't really want to bet the flop, but now get to the turn and are trying to, fold out our strong king highs or ace highs that check back. So they may have some broadways that want to bluff here. So if we look through the solution for their weak hands, or their trash hands rather, you'll see that the overbet hands that are going to get to the turn that don't have much equity are going to be those king high, queen high, jack high, 10-9 type hands. So against the weak hands, we actually have a lot of value to show down with. And against the strong hands, we have very significant blockers. So that's going to be one of the keys to bluff catching, is blocking the value and unblocking the weak hands, as well as beating the weak hands. Let's continue with the hand in progress. So we do face the large size. Let's defend the turn. And the interesting part that we've all been waiting for, villain shoves all in, and we're facing a tough decision. Now, first, I want to go over what my thought process was in game. So I'm just going to click play and you guys can hear what I was actually thinking in game while I was thinking through the fundamentals and the heuristics for making a big call in this spot. We're blocking the value pretty dang heavily. They're repping queens, kings, jacks, and aces, and we block aces and queens. If they ever have 10-9 suited, if they ever have some random, like, Broadway hands. So you can hear my past self going over what their range is, and I actually do a pretty good job, not to pat myself on the back, of thinking through all of their value, all of their weak hands, and then thinking, okay, does this hand have the appropriate blockers for blocking the value, unblocking the weak hands, and is it, a spot where I want to bluff catch? Gotta make a big call here. I don't think they're shoving ace king either. Another important thought is that sometimes a villain might have ace king as a semi-bluff. And if they do, we look pretty silly making a big call here. But I, in-game, thought that they weren't going to have those combos. I thought maybe if they were going to bet turn with ace king, that it wouldn't turn those hands into a bluff. It would rather choose something like king high or queen high or 10 high before the villain chose to bluff ace high. Why do I want to call here? So let's have a look before we look at the results of what to think about and what the fundamentals are of making a big bluff catch in this scenario. Now that we're at the river, we can talk about the fundamentals of bluff catching. One of them being MDF. Minimum defense frequency. This is a concept that has been covered a lot in prior videos of GTO Wizard's library. So if you're not familiar with that concept, I suggest you review some of the videos that cover it, because we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty math about MDF today, but just understanding what MDF is and looking at an equilibrium will give you a very good idea of the core concepts for bluff catching. But today I'm going to deep dive into using blockers and our real life example that I pulled up for us today. First thing that I like to think about before I bluff catch is, what is villain's range? So let's take a look at the scenario in which the small blind shoves the river. So they shove the river, and I like to think about the value hands first. So what are their best hands and what are their good hands? Because these are going to be the hands that are classified as typically value bets. After a certain equity threshold, using the equity buckets, you can determine that it's very likely that the solver is looking to get value from these hands if they have a certain amount of equity. So aces, kings, queens, jacks, these are all fairly intuitive value bets from the small blind. You can also see that we have some top pair here, like king jack and queen jack, that might have been bluffing on the turn but get there on the river. We have some trips that would have slow played on flop, as well as starting to bet turn and river. And then we have some of the more obvious slow plays like quads, a little bit of the pocket nines in there, which might be the bottom part of villain's value range. So it's important to understand what the value range looks like. Next, I'm going to look at what their weaker hands are going to be. So in this case, it looks like there are no weak hands that are bluffing. There are only trash hands, which makes a lot of sense, because if you have a polarized range as the small blind and you're bluffing here, you're going to bluff a very polarized range, which means you're going to have hands with very little equity and hands with a lot of equity. So that's why you see the best hands and the trash hands have the most common frequency in villain's range. So looking at the trash hands, it looks like they are bluffing hands like king high, queen high, and 10 high. So a fairly narrow range here for bluffing, but it does make a lot of sense because the jack did come on the river. So those jack high hands aren't going to be a bluff anymore. They're going to be value. Next, I like to look at my range. What are the hands at the top of my range, and what are the hands that are classified as bluff catchers? Now, this is a word that is thrown around a lot, but typically your bluff catchers are going to be the hands that are indifferent to calling by the river. So we can take a look at the different equity buckets again for our range, and we can see here that the best hands are going to be very intuitive calls. Most likely it's going to be very strong hands that get to the river that are at the top of our range. So hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, we have some trips in there, some full houses, and some ace jack if we decided to float the turn with those combos as well. So those are the hands that aren't too difficult to understand that you need to call. Otherwise, if you're not calling these combos, villain is going to print money by bluffing their entire range, and we don't want that. So looking at the next category, you have some good hands. There aren't too many good hands in this one, simply just queen jack suited, because these are going to be hands that have enough equity but are also maybe blocking top pair. Again, if you float the turn with a hand like queen jack and you hit a jack, it's pretty likely that you're going to need to call the river with it as well, because one of the reasons you're floating the turn with queen jack is so that you can have some coverage on a queen or jack river, or that you're also covering villain's good hands of pocket queens and pocket jacks, and so that you have a hand to bluff with if the action goes check check. So another hand that is pretty fair, pretty intuitive to call on river. Then we start getting to the weak hands. These, again, same idea. We're going to have typically the stronger part of our range still looking to call and make villain indifferent. And then we get to the trash hands. These are typically going to be the 0 EV bluff catchers that we were talking about. And we see my hand in particular right there, ace queen offsuit, in which I am facing a large bet with. Now, thinking about my entire range, we have a lot of those best hands, a lot of those good hands, but I just got to the river with ace queen. Now, what blockers do I have to their value? what blockers do I have to their weak hands? Do I have too many blockers to their weak hands? Are they going to bluff enough on the river? What is my bluff catching frequency going to look like? These are all questions that I like to ask myself before I click call. So let's take a deeper dive into all of our different combos in this scenario. First off, we have hands that want to bluff catch like 6-5 suited. This is a good example in this particular scenario of a hand that blocks value and unblocks bluffs. If we take a look at the small blind's bluffing range again, we will see that they prefer a lot of Broadway combos as well as 10-9 suited. This is a spot where we unblock bluffs clearly. And then if we take a look at their best hands, the value hands, we are blocking a value hand of pocket sixes. Obviously, this is a scenario where we unblock bluffs, we block the value hands. That's why we see the solver call at 100% frequency with that hand. And if we take a look at our hand in question, ace queen offsuit, it's a little bit trickier. So again, let's take a look at the hands that ace queen blocks for value and unblocks as the weak hands. So if we filter for the best hands first and we go all in as small blind, we'll see that we are in fact blocking hands like pocket aces, ace 8 suited, pocket queens, and queen jack suited. So these are all good hands to be blocking, which is why ace queen is considered a good hand to bluff catch. Now, if we take a look at the trash hands, there are some hands in which we are blocking, which is not the best, right? So if we see the all-in here, we'll see that we are blocking some combos of king-queen, as well as queen-10 and king-queen offsuit. So yes, we are blocking value, but we're also blocking some of the bluffs. So this isn't the most ideal hand. However, because of MDF and because we need to make villain indifferent to bluffing, we need to add some of these bluff catchers in, which is why we see some of these 0 EV calls with hands like ace queen, because we are still blocking a lot of the value, even though we're blocking a few of the bluffs. Let's take a look at a combo that is actually stronger than ace queen. However, it's a worse bluff catcher, and that's ace king offsuit. So if we look at our call range here from the cutoff, and we look at the ace king offsuit combos, we'll see that it's an actual pure fold, even though it is technically better than ace queen offsuit. Now, why is that? Well, if we look back at the small blind again, we'll see their bluffing range is going to contain a lot of king X in it, right? So there's a lot of blocking these bluffs here. And if we look at the value hands, you'll see that there's only a few combos of aces that are going to take this line as the small blind. Kings are there, king jack suited, king jack offsuit. But if you take a look at the value versus the bluffs that ace king blocks, ace queen does a better job of blocking the value. So that's why we see ace queen be a call and ace king be a fold in our range. Also, that being said, when we have ace king, it's less likely they have some weaker checkbacks, like ace king themselves, which is going to be in their range. So you can see here, villain doesn't choose to bluff ace king. And like I mentioned in game, it was really important that I knew villain wasn't going to bluff ace king, because then obviously calling ace queen might not be good either. So it's a very delicate balance when you're looking at an equilibrium and thinking about MDF, which combos are going to be in our bluff catching range, which combos are going to be in our always call range, which hands are going to be in our fold range. So these are the things that you need to be thinking about when you're going through all of the different concepts. We're blocking the value pretty dang heavily. They're repping queens, kings, jacks, and aces, and we block aces and queens. If they ever have 10-9 suited, if they ever have some random like Broadway hands, gotta make a big call here. I don't think they're shoving ace king either. Why do I want to call here? Oh. Let's go.